The people of England had more rights than most of the other people in Europe. And so the colonists, being subjects of England, expected that they would have the same rights. In particular, they wanted to have some type of representative government. Now, a representative government is a government where the people have some say in what happens, and it's not just the monarch or the king or queen who says what happens. So the colonists expected their government to preserve their basic rights as English subjects. Now, how did the Englishmen get those rights? Well, it happened a long time before, so back in the 1200s. In 1215, King John of England was forced to accept the Magna Carta, and that's Latin, it means Great Charter. And the Magna Carta granted rights to English noblemen and freemen, so it was one of the first important documents that gave rights to the people. And some of these rights included that a person cannot have their property seized by the king or his officials. In most cases, people couldn't be taxed unless a council agreed. Someone couldn't be put on trial without witnesses, and someone could only be punished by a jury of his or her peers. So these are some rights that we have now in America that were actually fairly unique for the time. And over time, the rights of the Magna Carta were granted to all English people. And so here's a painting showing King John. So it's an illustration, actually. Okay, so the Magna Carta was one of the first things that happened in England for the English subjects to gain rights. The next one was Parliament. So Parliament is England's chief lawmaking body. It still exists today, and it has two houses. It has the House of Commons, and the House of Commons, the members of the House of Commons are elected by the people. And you have the House of Lords, and the members of the House of Lords are not elected. English colonists, so people in the colonies, formed representative assemblies like the House of Commons back in England. These colonists in some ways governed themselves. However, England had authority over these colonial governments, and Parliament back in England had no representatives from the colonies. So even though they had no representatives from the colonies, Parliament passed laws that affected the colonies. And so the colonies disliked these laws because they didn't have any say in them. So they had their own assemblies, but England had authority over the governments and passed laws, and they passed laws without having any representatives from the colonies agree. So the colonists disliked these laws, and they would often clash with the royal governor who had been appointed by the king and not elected. In 1685, James II became king, and he imposed strict rule on the colonies. He combined Massachusetts and the northern colonies into one dominion, and he appointed a royal governor named Edmund Andros to rule the dominion. So here's a picture of Edmund Andros. I thought that was a picture. Hold on. So here's a picture of Sir Edmund Andros. So he was appointed by the king. He was a British colonial governor in America. And Andros ended the representative assembly. So before, the colonies had these representative assemblies in their own colonies, and he ended those. And as a result, the colonists refused to pay taxes. Meanwhile, back in England, there was something going on where the English Parliament overthrew King James. So they didn't like King James for a number of reasons, one of them mostly religious, and they appointed instead William and Mary to be king and queen. This change in leadership was called England's Glorious Revolution. It had the name Glorious Revolution because it happened without bloodshed, and that happened in 1688. And William and Mary upheld the English Bill of Rights from 1689. So this Bill of Rights had a number of different things expanding on the rights of the people. And one was that the monarch cannot cancel laws. So if the assemblies, if Parliament makes laws, the monarch can't just cancel them. The monarch cannot impose taxes unless Parliament agrees. There have to be free elections and frequent meetings of Parliament, because before, the king had restricted how often the Parliament could meet, and so that's not true anymore. Excessive fines and cruel punishment were forbidden, and people could complain to the monarch without being arrested. Now, if you look at these Bill of Rights and you look at the Bill of Rights of the United States, you can see that our Bill of Rights is kind of modeled on these rights, some of them. And this established a government based on law and not on the desires of the ruler. So England was definitely in the forefront of establishing representative government. The American colonists, meantime, claimed these same rights as they were subjects of England. So after the Glorious Revolution, Massachusetts again regained self-government. They still had a king-appointed royal governor, but this governor and his council and the Colonial Assembly shared power. So let's take a look at that. So the monarch of England, who appoints a royal governor. This governor was appointed by the crown. He oversaw the trade, the colonial trade. He had final approval on the laws, and he could dismiss the Colonial Assembly. Now, the governor appointed his own council, so they were appointed by the governor. They were an advisory board to the governor, and they acted as the highest court in each colony. The Colonial Assembly were elected by eligible colonists, so these were elected people. They made laws, they had the authority to tax, and they paid the governor's salary. So the governor could strike down laws, so the governor could strike down the laws that they made, but the assembly was responsible for his salary. So if the governor blocked a law, the assembly might refuse to pay him. England, in the meantime, back in Europe, really had little involvement in the colonial affairs, and that's called salutary neglect. So it just kind of didn't really bother to get involved. And so because of that, the governors rarely enforced certain laws, and the colonists felt independent. One other right that was beginning to come around at this time was the right of free speech and freedom of the press. So beginning to come around. There was someone named John Peter Zenger. He was the publisher of the New York Weekly Journal. And in 1735, he printed a criticism of New York's government. At that time, it was illegal to criticize the government in print. So he stood trial, and the jury said, no, he has the right to speak the truth. He's released, and this is a movement towards the freedom of the press.